in one state collapse, and the chain of Rice University statistically finds, quote, that U.S. troops are correlated with a decrease in the troop level of the host state. The presence of U.S. troops is not resulting in a large increase in security, as the host state is weakening itself. In Iraq specifically, fear on a Stanford University confirms that, quote, the more we do, the less will be done by parties in the area who the United States wants to develop their own capabilities. Yet the only good way to get rid of ISIS in the long run is to let local actors deal with it. This because, as Mossy, the International Business Times finds, quote, the military superiority of the U.S. doesn't count for very much. Counterinsurgency is mostly political, so it is actually better to use local forces on the ground. Thus, this area is the real news, finds it because, quote, the U.S. made Iraq dependent for its security and defense. Iraq is vulnerable to all possible threats from the outside because it can't defend itself. Mueller, the international studies guru, empirically impacts that, quote, the likelihood of militarily dependent developing democracies being able to maintain stability was 13%, while the likelihood of regime stability among developing democracies that were not dependent was 78%. The trade-off occurs across the entire region. Traub of the Center for International Cooperation explains, quote, Obama has said that the United States will henceforth work with partners when it comes to counterterrorism, and it's precisely the American abdication that necessitated new Arab activism. The result was, quote, the Arab League creating a response force of 40,000 military professionals from a variety of nations and will be adopted in a couple of weeks. Insofar as U.S. withdrawal has elicited regional action, the trade-off is clear that it is the United States that reduces regional commitments. This is problematic because Conway Decatur Institute notes that, quote, states in the region have stronger economic and political ties with warring parties and a better understanding of the conflict. Comparatively, quote, American support for military action tends to decline dramatically at the prospect of an occupation that will entail casualties. The erosion of public support leads to the erosion of congressional support, resulting in serious divisions within the government directing the intervention. The military is virtually assured failure, end quote. Contention 2 human rights abuses. These occur in 3 different ways. First, the blind eye. Hassan of Foreign Policy writes in, quote, the operation lasted over barely. U.S. forces turned a blind eye to the abuse and conduct of militias. As the militias targeted minorities in the area. Militias and Iraqi security forces burned Sunni villages to the ground, destroyed homes, and looted entire villages. When we can protect people but don't, they blame us for their suffering. Second, collective punishment. The MHRI writes in the last invasion, quote, the U.S. applied the method of collective punishment of civilians with the pretense that armed groups live among them. The U.S. bombed the city of Fallujah, killing more than 1,200 people, while women and children and elderly were being killed and families were driven out of their homes. Third, Paxton, the University of Utah writes, by invigorating corrupt governments, quote, a supportive intervention increases extrajudicial killing by 130%, disappearance by 239%, torture by 66%, and political imprisonment by 70%. The impact is twofold. First, lost soft power. The Center for Boundary Peace states that, quote, formidable tasks will be even more difficult if charges of human rights abuses undermine America's military standing. Opponents of the U.S. exploit war crime charges to undermine America's credibility in military operations, and allies will find it difficult to support missions in order to build coalitions and deploy troops effectively. The U.S. must have credibility as a protector of human rights. Nye at Harvard confirms the importance, writing that, quote, some transnational issues cannot be managed without the help of other countries, including infectious diseases, stability of global financial markets, WNDs, narcotics trafficking, international crime, and terrorism. Second, increased terrorism. Piazza of UNC writes that, quote, state violation of human rights makes terrorist appeals for support more effective. Brutal treatment of non-combatants by the state can facilitate mobilization efforts of militants, radicalizing formerly passive populations and fostering conditions under which ethnic, religious, or social groups experience communal discrimination, constructing collective grievances against the state. These are ripe for exploitation by terrorist groups, enhancing popular support for anti-system violence. Thus, he finds that reducing, quote, physical integrity rates by 1 unit out of 8 increases the number of terrorist attacks by between 17 and 40%. In fact, Alexander of the Washington Post finds that, quote, at least half of our losses and casualties in Iraq have come because of our program on detainee abuse. The number of soldiers who have died because of our torture policy is closer to the number of lives lost from 9/11. Thus, we negate. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to take running prep time, starting right now.
best way to end terrorist violence is to make sure that the twisted calls of terrorist leaders fall on deaf ears. We affirm and observe that long-term nation building in Iraq is the United States' best interest for 3 reasons. First is the risk of terrorism. According to Max Boot of the Council on Foreign Relations, Iraq is the highest terrorism risk of any country in the world. In fact, according to the Telegraph, casualties have increased 30% in the last year alone. According to Michael Leiter, the former Defense Department Director for the Counterterrorism Center, Iraqi terrorism is as significant and complex a threat as we have faced since 9/11. Second is economic harms. Because of U.S. economic exposure to global oil shocks, Stephen Biddle of George Washington University quantifies that continued conflict in Iraq could cost the U.S. as much as $750 billion a year in GDP. Third, a deteriorating situation. According to Max Boot of the Council on Foreign Relations, failing to act now necessitates a more costly war later on because of political and strategic necessity brought on by the worsening situation. He adds that by contrast, acting now enhances the odds of operational success. Contention 1 is nation building. Subpoint A is political inclusivity. According to the Foreign Policy Journal, in Iraq, the root causes of insurgency come from a disenfranchisement of Sunnis by the Iraqi government. In the absence of political freedom, Iraqi Sunnis lack legitimate outlets to express their political grievances, making them more likely to resort to political violence and terrorism. Fortunately, Paul Shari writes that a more inclusive political security architecture in Iraq would give Sunnis a viable alternative to extremism. Committing combat ground troops to fight ISIL facilitates a more inclusive Iraq in 2 ways. First is government cooperation. Stephen Biddle of George Washington University writes that troop deployment can be used as leverage to force Iraqi government cooperation with the U.S. in accommodating Sunni interests through the political process. Moreover, the presence of troops would pose a threat to the regime, urging cooperation with U.S. interests and holding the government accountable to its promises. Xiaozhan Li of Stanford University confirms this empirically, finding the deployment of 10,000 U.S. troops results in an increase in cooperation on a 1 point for a 10-point scale. Second is democratization. According to Tim Kaine of Stanford University, U.S. troop deployments facilitate democratic inclusiveness by monitoring and protecting elections in order to guarantee their safety and fairness. Empirically, James Merrick at the Castleberry Peace Institute finds that nations which experience a U.S. military intervention are 15% more likely to make democratic gains in the next 3 years. Democracy is crucial to long-term solutions to terrorism because free and fair elections ensure that desirable changes can be brought about by voters. In Iraq, the result is in Sunni inclusivity, eliminating the need for both the Islamic State and all other future terrorist organizations. Overall, study by Quan Lee of the Pennsylvania State University finds that a 13% increase in democratic participation reduces the incidence of terrorism by 11%. Subpoint B is economic development. Fernando de Soto of Columbia University writes that economic hope is the only way to win the battle for the constituencies on which terrorist group feeds. To make it impossible for radical leaders to recruit terrorists in the first place, we need to show the potential recruits a better option by offering the possibility of financial success. Committing combat ground troops to fight ISIL would increase economic development for 2 reasons. First is increased investment. Tim Kaine of Stanford University finds that the perceived security guarantee of U.S. troops is a powerful signal to foreign investors and international firms, spurring higher levels of both domestic and foreign direct investment into the economy and stimulating growth. Second is reduced defense spending. Kaine of Stanford University also explains that the presence of American security forces allows a host nation to lower its own defense expenditures, reducing government consumption and allowing the country to use more of its own resources for physical and human capital accumulation, generating economic growth once again. As a result, Tim Kaine of Stanford University concludes that the 10-year basing of 10,000 American troops on average boosts growth rates by 1.5% annually for half a century. Drew Schaub of Pennsylvania State University quantifies the resulting decrease in terrorism, finding that a 1% increase in GDP per capita of a country decreases the number of terrorist incidents by 19.3%. Because we pave a better solution without even necessarily having to defeat ISIL first, we urge pro-ballot.
So then, your main war in first contention is like American study that tells you that like you rate democracy 15%.
That was the second one.
Okay, yeah, sure. So like that like 15% that like aggregates all total interventions that have happened because of the United States. What happens when you look at it by case basis?
I think that's what it does. It looks at all the cases.
He adds up like all the changes in intervention, but what he finds when you look at a case-by-case basis
That's exactly what it's doing.
80%
It's
of
analyzing all the cases. I don't get a difference.
80% of democracies he found either had no change or actually had a decrease in
So that's a conflicting piece of
when
evidence,
you
right?
intervene.
And as we expand on this throughout the round, we're going to point out that the
Here's why
situation in
the
Iraq
15%
is particularly ripe for like a more inclusive democracy.
Here's why
Let
the
me ask a question
15%.
now.
Wait, can I just like elaborate on this and you ask the
Sure.
question? Here's why the 15% status skewed. If the 20% that succeed on like basically it's like the 20% that succeed on like very
Those
successful
are
outliers.
contradictory pieces of evidence. Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So in your second contention, you say that the local Iraqi militias and the government forces commit human rights abuses, right? So, but in your first contention, you tell me that committing combat ground troops means there's less expenditures and less of these troops, right?
No, what we're talking about is a decrease in governmental troops. But what happens is
Yes,
most of these
okay,
are
so
unaffiliated
you say
Shia
there's a
militias
decrease
are
in
still
governmental
committing human
troops,
rights abuses.
and then you say the governmental troops commit
No,
human rights
we're
abuses.
also talking about things like Shia militias that aren't affiliated with
I know,
the government.
so the Shia militias, right,
Yeah.
are committing human rights abuses, sure is what you're saying, right? But you also said, I listened to the piece of evidence, that Shia militia forces and the Iraqi security forces are committing human rights abuses. So there's less expenditures on Iraqi security forces, wouldn't there logically mean there's less human rights abuses going
I'd
on?
still argue that first of all, like invigorating, like institutionalizing corruption within the government, like cancels out this like hypothetical.
How are you
decrease.
institutionalizing corruption within the
We
government?
give you that with the Paxton card, where essentially what happens is when we make the fight against ISIS for countries like Syria easier, and institutionalizes corruption. But can I ask you a
How?
question?
I just asked for the warrant for that.
Yeah, Paxton gives you the warrant. He says that when the United States helps these governments, not only do we one legitimize them within the region, but two make their fight against ISIS easier, so they can like
Why is
basically oppress
legitimate
their own
government
people.
bad?
Wait,
Look, all I'm saying is, right,
legitimizing a corrupt government is bad. I wouldn't argue that legitimizing a government in general.
I
is
would
bad.
argue
That's
that by
the question.
committing less human rights abuses, which was what your whole second contention is about, I'd be turning your
The
case and
militias
making
are
everything
still,
better.
the militias are still there. Now, can I ask a question?
Okay, sure.
What's your link in your first contention behind like the United States definitively doing nation building when they like go against ISIS?
What do you mean, like, why do we believe that we
How
actually
like
do
yeah,
nation
how do
building?
we like can we like read a single piece of evidence that confirms that if we vote pro, like we're gonna do nation building?
According to CNN, what happened in 2003 was a mistake because George Bush literally explicitly said, I am not going to be committed to a long-term nation-building solution in Iraq. President Obama has said many a time that if we were to intervene in Iraq again, we would be
What has
committed to
President
nation-building
Obama
this
said
time.
about sending ground forces against ISIS?
What?
What has President Obama said against sending ground troops against ISIS?
He said that if we were to intervene, he says, I don't want to intervene,
that it's
but
not
if
in our
we were to
national
act,
security
that we would.
interests. Why are we
What?
like making this entire tension like contingent on what Obama is saying?
Because you asked me why do we know that he's committed to nation building, and I'm telling you, he said he's committed to nation building.
Wait, quickly, we're off track. Can I just see like the thing that Obama said,
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
read that right? Yeah, of course. Starting point. Okay, and we're gonna restart right now. Thank you. 57 years. Everyone's ready? Yeah. Oliver?
Yep.
And all three judges?
There's going to be two distinctive ways you can negate. First, if we can go through all their impacts at the top of their case and prove to you that they were delinking them out of U.S. interest, because unless they link all their impacts back to U.S. interest, you can't affirm. But second of all, if we can show you a long-term structural harm to the countries that we're intervening in, that should outweigh what they're talking about, because the long-term structural harms are going to be the biggest, are going to be the hardest to reverse later on. That being said, their entire case is contingent on saying that ground troops in ISIS would be carrying out nation building. That one part at the top of their case from Obama. That being said, there's a few problems with this. First of all, what the card that they just handed me said, Obama said, I learned from Libya that you have to carry out nation building. It doesn't say that against ISIS, he would use nation building. In fact, you can look to Stuyvesant of the New York Times, who actually tells you that Obama has carefully steered the United States toward a lesser role of global responsibility. We're shifting away from this type of tactic. But second of all, realize that even if Obama wants to perform nation building, he has to go through Congress, and Congress and the American people have had enough of drawn-out wars. They need to tell you that we're actually going to be able to institute nation building before they link it to anything in their case. That being said, they give you 3 reasons why Iraq is going to be important. And the first is going to be that there's this terror risk. If we exacerbate the terror risk, then we shouldn't be intervening. Look to Troy at the University of Illinois. A pro-government troop intervention increased the amount of suicide terrorism by 347% because we inspire retaliation. Next, they talk about oil. First, you can look to Bakovich of Columbia, who tells you U.S. oil markets are actually shifting away from the Middle East, which means they're less geopolitically important. Second of all, Glasser of the National Interest quantifies that right now we only get 20% of our oil from them, and that's going to fall 55% in coming years. Finally, you can turn oil, because if you look at the Financial Times, they tell you that military action actually increases oil prices, which bites into the impact that they're saying happening. Next, they just say that like if we have to intervene now or we will have to later on, but the resolution is about whether or not we should even be considering troops as an option. We're just saying that if it's off the table, then this intervention later on isn't going to happen. Their first contention is on nation building, and first they talk about the first word is cooperation and leverage. First of all, you can look to the Iraqi Prime Minister, who said that they explicitly don't want U.S. troops in the country. I don't think we're going to be able to get him to leverage him into doing anything if he doesn't want U.S. troops there in the first place. But second of all, you can look to the fact that this just clean did not work in Iraq. If you looked at Harith Hassan of Tufts University, tells you that the nation building was based on exclusion, where we just put Shia into the government and didn't bring in the Sunnis, which is why the Iraq problem happened in the first place. But then you can next they talk about democratization and they bring up Munich. Remember what Oliver tells you in rebuttal. They just say that the average increase of democracy is 15%, but if you actually look to what Munich says, he says that that's just because of outliers. In 70 to 90% of the countries that he looked at, there was either zero or reverse impact on actual democracy. And that furthermore, you can look to McFall of Stanford University, who tells you that 71% of our interventions either failed or created what's called a partial democracy. These partial democracies basically try and grab at legitimacy, but they don't have strong enough institutions, which means that Snyder of MIT tells you that they're actually 4 times more likely to go to war. So the problem here is that they're not proving to you any type of success, but so first of all, we're delinking them because they actually aren't causing a democracy in the vast majority of circumstances, but second of all, we're turning the argument because the marginal progress that they make just don't actually produce anything. Look to Arthur Goldsmith at the University of Massachusetts. He actually looked at 700 interventions and doesn't find that there's any type of success because we try to set up rickety institutions that serve our interests. We're not in the best interest of the people, which means that we aren't going to gain access to these democratic impacts. Their second contention is about economics, and their first word is about investment. You can look to Acklin of UPenn, who tells you that a 1% increase in troops actually causes a 3 to 7% increase in the risk of a financial crisis, because investors and the government overestimate the stabilizing effect of troops, which means that they put all this money in the country. When the troops don't solve for stability, they pull their money out, and it causes a financial crisis. But second of all, you can look to when they talk about less defense spending, this concedes our dependency argument. This concedes the idea that when we do defense work for them, they do less defense work themselves. Look to Sandler of UT Dallas. He finds that a 1% decrease in military spending increases the amount of terrorism by 23%, because these countries can't serve their own interests, which is always going to make them less stable in the long run. If they want to stabilize the region, they don't do it by making these countries have weaker security apparatuses. But then they talk about this 1.5% stabilized growth over half a century. But realize that if the financial crisis argument tells you that it's going to be more volatile, and if the market is more volatile, people aren't going to have any faith in their ability to have economic security, they turn to terrorism. Thank you.
We'll take running prep time starting right now. Okay. I'm going to go over Tim's responses to my framework, and then I'm just going to go down their case and focus on mine afterwards. So, are my phones ready?
Yes.
Order. Yeah. Yep. Okay. Tim starts his rebuttal by analyzing the piece of evidence Ben brought up in Crossfire, the CNN analysis. CNN tells you 2 things. One, the first Iraqi war was not waged from a perspective of nation building. From that, I'm going to delink almost all of this offense. But second, it says, quote, indeed, Obama himself has realized this unavoidable reality that he learned from the Libyan strikes, that military intervention without nation building is doomed to failure. Insofar as that is true, I fulfill the burden that I just need to show that it's a reasonable possibility that nation building is implemented in order for me to advocate for it. I do that, we do nation building. Let's go on to framework generally. We should evaluate this round and who offers a better long-term solution, because even if short-term things happen, right, the long-term outweighs that just on magnitude for 3 reasons. First is perpetual terrorism due to instability, because we give you an observation 1. Second is $750 billion due to oil revenue. My opponent says we're diversifying away, but that's still the only concrete number given to you, and it's due to lost revenue, not things like shocks, right? And so insofar as he doesn't respond to that link, it should still be evaluated as like the largest quantifiable impact in today's round. So with that, let's specifically go to his first contention, in which he talks about like Iraqis valid military dependence and a lot of things like that. So first, this is really important. It turns his second contention really hard, because them saying that us putting troops on the ground decreases the amount of troops that are like operating nationally within Iraq and Iran, like that's a big deal, because he says in his second contention, those are the troops that are perpetuating the human rights abuses. He says the Shia militia and the Iraqi central government are so freaking bad, but we're getting rid of them by putting our troops on the ground. It cold turns it. That's the only solution, is to like demobilize sectarian Shia factions in Sunni areas. We're the only ones that show any form of solvency. Next, he talks about how counterinsurgency is a political problem. Yeah, but we're not advocating for counterinsurgency. We're advocating for like nation building and also a war against ISIL. The word counterinsurgency never appears in our case. Third, he says the military aid is bad because it leads to collapse. So 2 things. One is really important, and this ties into the long-term solution argument that I'm making throughout this entire round. Military aid is the status quo, guys. We give billions of dollars to Iraqi military aid, and that's what's causing ongoing instability. What is the solution to us giving military aid is the long-term eradication of terror in Iraq and Syria and the institution of a stable, structural solution to the problem. We're the only people that give you even the risk of that happening, and that's why you're voting for us. But second is that this concedes that troops go down, increasing troops in these areas increases growth, because funds diverted away from the military go to more productive sectors of the economy, which concedes the second link in our the first link in our second contention, which is that like economic growth decreases terrorism in the long run. So next he talks, last in this contention, he talks about how the Arab League also has troops and that local actors are better. But what are they not better at doing? They're not better at one, nation building, because my opponent doesn't provide any evidence about that, and we show you that the United States is really good at nation building. But here's what they're really bad at. They're really bad at getting Western countries to invest. That's what we're saying. We're saying when the U.S. goes in, it boosts Western investor confidence. My opponent says in his rebuttal that there's a 3% increase in collapse and risk of financial collapse. So 1, he doesn't quantify how bad the financial crisis is. 2, 3% is really low. And 3, that's if they collapse, if there's ongoing instability, which he never proves. So dealing with that and extend the argument. Let's go to their second contention, which is human rights abuses. Remember, we cold turned this with the argument that we put troops on the ground and decrease the amount of Shia militias, which by the way are backed by the government. They're funded and given arms to by the government. So the same exact logic applies that my opponent's trying to get you. Then he talks about how this impact only happens if we fail to protect people from Shia militia backlash, because they see us as perpetrating the crimes too. But that's if we fail to protect them, right? They never prove that we actually fail to protect them, so there's no link there. Next he talks about Fallujah, but remember I told you that the 2003 invasion wasn't from the perspective of nation building. Next they talk about more extrajudicial killings, same response applies there. Then they say that allies will like us less, and that's a big deal because Nye talks about diseases and a lot of negative impacts from soft power, but there's no bright line there. They don't tell you that we lose the amount of soft power necessary to stop our ability to combat transnational diseases. I think Saudi Arabia still wants our help to combat Ebola, even if they don't like what we're doing on the ground with Iraq. Lastly, they don't tell you how many people died. They don't provide a sustainable security architecture for Iraq. They don't link to any long-term solvency. We win the round. Thank you.
All 3 judges ready? You mind if I ask the first question?
Go ahead.
Is what Obama says the policy, the most likely policy?
What I have to show today is that it's a realistic, possible option, and then I get to advocate for it, right?
Yeah, and
so
what
obviously, look, there's a little bit of wiggle room for any affirmative team to do what they want. It can't be a plan. It has to be realistic. It has to be something we might see in a possible eventuality.
And what I tried to say in my rebuttal was that after 15 years of attempted nation building and military intervention in Iraq and Afghanistan, the United States people in Congress probably don't want to perform another nation building operation.
So can I turn those tables on you a little bit? Can you provide me with this evidence that says that we've been trying to nation build for 15 years?
I can give you evidence that we attempted to nation build in Iraq.
Can you give me that evidence actually?
Yes, I can
word
actually give it
nation
to you.
build.
Yeah, it says it was nation building and even better
the word-
based on exclusion.
The word-
It says
the word intent, right? I want the words, it's like that we ingredient intention. Because nation build, right, is a term that a lot of like
What, do we
magazines
accidentally nation build? Like, so we put it in the Prime Minister?
Right, yeah. So I'll explain, right? So like a lot of people writing about the Iraq conflict use like words like nation building to like map their own concerns about what's going on into the ground onto like their articles, right? But my piece of evidence specifically talks about what like the politicians themselves are thinking and saying, and that makes it preferable to the judges because you know what
But you don't prove that the politicians is thinking and saying
Yeah,
about
it
that.
does,
You
it
just
does,
prove
yeah.
that one does, which is Obama. But I can
the
literally
head one, like the guy.
Quote, the excessive violence in Iraq was an outcome of nation-building process that was based on exclusion.
All right, so one, I read you, like, I literally read you the card at the top of my first card I read, which said, like, Bush didn't care at all about nation building. He cared, let's be honest.
Why did they carry out nation-building?
We really didn't. It was an afterthought. Like, let's be honest, Tim, let's be honest, right? First Iraq War was about, like, oil, phony weapons of mass destruction, and maybe a little bit of counterterrorism. We didn't go in there to nation build at all, and let's not tell ourselves that we did. So,
Okay.
can I ask a question?
Actually, can I ask
a question?
Can I ask a quick last one?
No,
Just
you
very
ask.
quickly,
No,
like yes or
no,
no.
Tim, no, you
All
can
right,
ask.
go ahead.
So you talk about like a decline in oil, like dependence on the Middle East, right?
Yes.
So how does that make lost revenue less significant in terms of like cash in my pocket?
What do you mean?
So like if I'm like no longer as dependent on the Middle East, right? Well, like currently I'm making $750 billion a year in terms of like production revenue. How does your thing interact at all with what I'm saying?
Wait. So your entire argument is saying that there's a lot of oil in Iraq?
Being not produced.
No, but like what we're trying to say is that that doesn't matter because we wouldn't buy the Iraqi oil.
No,
Can I ask you a
no.
question?
Like ExxonMobil has a pump in Iraq, right?
That's
And because
wonderful.
of, like,
That only makes up 20% of our oil. Can I ask you a
But
question?
it doesn't matter because it's still $750 billion. Like what you're saying does not interact with what I'm saying because maybe we're.
We would
less
just say
dependent
security
on Iraq,
outweighs. Can I
but
ask you a
it's
question
still-
now?
Okay, so you can see the impact then.
Wait, whoa.
Security
I
outweighs
just really want to let this question in. Your main piece of evidence proving the efficacy of nation building is mirrored, right?
No, we give you like our case
Your
is the
statistic.
efficacy.
Your
No, our
statistic
case
that
is
proves
the
it is
efficacy.
mirrored, right?
No, our case is the efficacy of nation building. Oh, also, but about mirroring, I guess time's up. If you want to answer, I can.
We have like 30 left.
Can I get an order?
Oh, yeah.
Can I get an order?
Oh, yeah, so 2 voters, that's it. Oh, wait, what?
One problem.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so their framework, our case. All the
Make it
judges,
easier, right?
all the judges ready now?
Repeat.
Framework, our case, then terms. Solve the framework, you will vote negatively when the links to the United States. Around 1 for oil. They dropped Troy. It tells you a 30 to 47% increase in terrorist attacks for pro-governmental intervention. And they dropped the Financial Times against oil. Remember, if you intervene, you increase prices in the short term. That outweighs any long-term impact they give you. With that in mind, first let's look at our case for dependency. They give 2 main responses. First, they say it like turns to second detention. But A, just because we're talking about decreasing troop commitment against ISIS. Even if that happens, they can still commit these human rights abuses. But B, remember, the militias that are carrying out the human rights abuses stay constant because they're not associated with the government. And second of all, when it comes to trial, they respond with like Western investment and like nation building. But I'd argue if only a couple of countries are getting like Western investment and nation building, that's outweighed by the fact that the entire region, as we show you with our trial impact, becomes dependent on the United States and are 6 times more likely to fail, as you show you with the Mueller impacts. Now with that in mind, let's look at human rights. Remember, first of all, the term doesn't exist. Then he says that there's no proof that we're like ignoring these human rights abuses. That flat out ignores the fact that last summer in America, Shia militias were massacring Sunnis and we flat out ignored it. Then remember that he said that we don't actually impacts lives. First of all, we give Piazza that tells you a 17 to 40% increase in terrorism, and second of all, the Washington Post that tells you 50% of all casualties in Iraq were due to the fact that we carry out human rights abuses, extend taxing the war that they never respond to, we institutionalize corruption, increase killings by 103%. With that in mind, let's extend terms. First of all, remember, the internal link doesn't exist because A, Stuyvesant says that Obama has stated he's moving away from global responsibility, and B, they need to prove that Congress and the people actually want it. But remember, Stanford tells you that 70% of the interventions create failed democracies. That links it to MIT. Their wars are 4 times more likely. Then look at Goldsmith, 700 interventions. He found no change whatsoever. And when you look to the remaining Munich, on a case-by-case basis, 80% of democracies either stay the same or they fail. Don't look at democracy. And when it comes to econ, remember, first Ackland tells you that shoots cause financial crises. This outweighs their 50-year card because remember, if you cause a crisis in the short term, you're not going to see these long-term benefits. And remember, extend Samuel tells you that because you're increasing dependency in the region, that's going to increase terrorism by 23% because these countries don't have competent military apparatuses. Thank you.
Can I see the piece of evidence on the entire region?
That was just the Arab. It was just like the Arab League.
Yeah, whatever you
That
got.
10 trials.
Like we usually do.
How much time do you have? So my partner's ready. Partner ready. On the judges already. Yeah, roadmap. Sorry. So it's going to be framing and what's the most important impact, and then it's going to be their offense as two voting issues, and then our offense as voting issues. Okay. So everyone's ready. So starting on framing, right? The most important impact in today's round is who can solve for terror in a long-term way. Terror is significant impact, right? It's increased 30% in the last year alone. It's only going to keep increasing exponentially from there, and it's the most significant threat we've had since 9/11. In terms of the lives of American citizens, this is the clearest, biggest impact in today's round. I'm framing the round for you right now on that issue. On their side, they have a couple pieces of offense. First, they talk about dependence and the fact that it's destabilizing the regime, right? First, they never linked it actually to terrorism, and the only way to actually end the dependence is end the terrorism that's going on in the region, so that we don't have to keep supplying aid and keep making the dependent in the status, like we do in the status quo. Then they talk about human rights abuses. And here's where we're getting an offensive voter on our side, right? Because they say that when we commit combat ground troops, the government is spending less revenue on its troops, right? Even the militias are supported by the government by that funding, right? So they're getting less funding. Also, the Iraqi security forces, which they say commit human rights abuses, they're getting less funding, which means there's less human rights abuses if you vote for us. And that's the biggest impact in today's round because they say it's a 40% increase in terrorism, right? If we're decreasing that, then it's a clear reason you can vote for on their case. But on our side, we also have a clear voting issue, and that's on the issue of nation building. And we get tied up, right, in whether we actually want to or intend to nation build, right? But the fact of the matter is, if we commit combat ground troops to fight ISIL, we get the economic impacts of our contention either way, regardless of intent. And that's very clear, because when we commit combat ground troops to fight ISIL, there's a perception of security in the region to investors. They go, Western troops are on the ground, the situation will be secure. So they invest in the region, they generate growth. Also, as they concede, the government spends less money on its military and diversifies that money into more productive sectors of the economy. Even if the risk of financial crash is 3% higher, the economic gains overall outweigh, which is why Tim Kaine at Stanford University still sees the 1.5% growth rate over the next 50 years long-term in today's round. Remember that the root cause of terrorism is these people not having an alternative to extremism. By giving them economic hope, the hope of prosperity, we give them an alternative. We give them something to grasp for, and we give them a reason to reject extremism and terrorism, which is the most important impact.
Do you mind if we ask the first question?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, sure. So, Ben, you stated in your summary that like it makes the region look like perceptually look like more of a stable investment to like these investors.
So that's one of the two.
So like, what happens when they realize that like war obviously is
Well,
the
so-
most stable investment?
So what happens is, right, that first, you agree, there is the perception, that's the first thing that happens, right?
that's the first thing that
So
happens.
yeah, I know,
when we get
Tim,
along.
I understand your
Then
argument, right?
people start investing, right?
So people start investing, right?
Yes, and
After people start investing, you have initially, in the very short term, a spurt of economic growth, a spurt of prosperity, right?
yes.
Right? That means that there's decreased terrorism, right? Because people are seeing all this increased investment,
In
they
the
go, I
short
have
term,
economic
yes.
growth.
Wait, Tim, I'll address what you're about to say, right?
Actually,
You're
I
gonna
haven't
say
even said it
That
yet,
means
so
that
please let me
before,
say it.
before
So
you
what
let the
was-
instability return and the investors pull out, that they're choosing something other than extremism. So you don't have that instability in
Wait,
the
but
first
here's
place.
the difference, right? If there's like this instability that says that like the economic instability, like the money gets pulled out, suddenly that economy isn't prosperous anymore. Doesn't that just all like convince the people in that country even
Tim,
more that the economy is an unsafe way to try and sustain
In the
themselves?
2008 crash erased all growth in GDP the United States experienced over the last 10 years.
Sorry.
Did the 2008 financial crisis experience all gains in GDP that the United States
I'd
experienced over
argue
the
that
last
like
10
the
years?
developed
Can you answer yes or no?
Wait, I would
Yes
say that the
or
United
no?
States compared to Iraq is
Yeah,
kind of like,
I'm just asking you a
Tim,
question.
this is a very simple
I'm asking
question.
you a question.
Our point is that maybe,
Wait,
yes.
please, like, answer the question.
wait, what are you trying to, wait, so just say like the crash was really bad?
No, was the crash enough to erase all gains in GDP that the United States experienced over the last 10 years? This is really important.
I don't think the question is relevant because I'd argue that like a country like
Oh
Iraq
my God.
is less insulated
I'm trying to answer a question that you think is irrelevant.
Look, I can understand that you think it's irrelevant, but please, like, I'm begging the question. Like, answer it for me.
Our
This is
point
important
is
for my
that
side.
growth outweighs even a large recession. But also, let me ask you this: what is a 3% increase in recession?
Here's
What
the
is that
no, no, no,
impact
no.
on
You,
growth?
you misheard our evidence. It's every 1% increase in troops causes a 3 to 7% increase.
What is a 1% increase in troops?
Like the amount of troops that are deployed.
So, like, what's the terminal increase in recession? And like, what
It depends on how many
50%
troops are
increase in
deployed.
recession from like 1% is like now we have a 1.5% risk of recession.
Wait, we have like 5,000 troops like on the ground, let's say, right? So like if we put another like 5,000 troops on the ground right now,
So
we
that's a
have like
50% increase? Oh, I
No,
get
that's
it.
a 3%.
Guys, despite this
No,
math,
of course
right?
not.
If this recession were to happen and it were to be so bad, then why are we still seeing the long-term growth rate of 1.5% annually over 50 years?
No, because what we're saying is that even if it's like growing steadily, it's happening in like bursts because there's
Yeah.
more financial
And
crises.
I don't-
But
Because
if people are
don't have faith in the
gradually
market.
having more economic opportunity, right, then they have more and more reason gradually to reject
I'd
extremism.
argue that like you're looking at the wrong sector of the economy if you want to like deal with terrorism. Insofar as we
I'm looking at
extend
the whole
Sandler-
economy.
Insofar as you extend Sandler, that tells you that less military spending will cause a jack in terrorist attacks by 23%.
I responded to that first off, that's a separate debate, but also that concedes our second link.
Okay, we have 24 seconds left. Opponents ready? Oliver?
Yep.
And the judges?
Yep.
Remember the terms we're extending on the impact. Oh, wait, do you want to go back? Okay. Start on the first way you can negate, which is if we prove that ISIS isn't a threat. Remember the two terms we've consistently extended. One, you cause oil instability by intervening, according to the Financial Times, which is going to cause the very instability that they say is a problem. And second of all, terrorism. Remember our narrative throughout this entire round. You are creating the problem in the first place. Troy shows you a 347% increase in terrorism, which can compound in the long term. The second way we're going to win is by the long-term structured harms that I told you at the top of my rebuttal. You are weighing more than everything else. Throughout this, they drop Pexin, the third ward on our human rights abuse contention. It tells you that you institutionalize these human rights abuses within the government of Iraq. That's going to mean that in the long term, in the structuralized way that's going to be hard to undo later, you're going to be seeing more human rights abuses.
Piazza tells you that that's going to cause a 70 to 40% increase in terrorism, and that's why the Washington Post tells you that 50% of our troop casualties in Iraq were because of things like detainee abuse. But we also give you the link through the blind eye. Last summer, we ignored the abuse that was happening. When we can't stop it but don't, they blame us. There are ways to vote for us on human rights. But then you can go back up to our first contention on dependency. Extend Trout. The entire region becomes dependent on a military intervention. Even if they prove that they stabilize Iraq, you destabilize the rest of the region because they're also becoming militarily dependent on us. On scope, you see our impacts are outweighing. But this is really big, is that they drop a lot of turns on nation building. Governance is a prerequisite to the economy. If we can win that the governance is failing, that means the economy is going to fail and it's going to take out their contention. Look to McFall. There's a 71% failure rate. And then you can look to their own Mirnick evidence. In 70 to 90% of cases, they either failed or actually got reverse progress. That's why, and finally, then you can move on to their economics argument. Sandler tells you that there's actually going to be more terrorism when you drop this defense spending because their security apparatuses are not good in the long term. That's a structural harm you can vote on. If they are not able to systematically defend themselves, that's going to mean that they are going to be a problem in the long term. And then Ackland, right? Financial crisis. 1% increase in troops is a 3 to 7% increase in the risk of a financial crisis. Our argument is if the economy is more unstable, even if it's increasing at like 1.5%, if it's more unstable, people don't have faith in the ability of the economy to support them, which takes out their link back to terrorism. But the bottom line is if they're dropping nation building, they can't even win that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. So, components are the questions. I'm going to go first on impact. Tim touched on that in his final focus. Then on his voters. Then on nation building, in my case. So, is everybody ready? All right. So, for oil, we're still pulling through the $750 billion number, even if there are some spikes. He doesn't weigh the spikes or quantify the spikes. That's the only clear and extended. Second, on terrorism, we tell you that even if there's no long-term solution in his world, there's still a 30% increase year over year, and that's what we have to solve with the long-term security architecture. Let's go to his two voters. First is dependence. The only way to solve dependence on military aid to fight terrorism is to take terrorism out of the equation. That means that if we even have a threat of solving with nation building, we should win this point because doing something is better than doing nothing. Next, on human rights violations. There are some ways to vote for him off of this. He said it in final focus, but there's one big reason not to. Because when we put troops on the ground, he concedes at the top of this first contention, Turn never responded to, that Shia militias and Iraqi government forces scale back their troop deployments. That's a net decrease in human rights violations. And last, he tries to extend some terms on nation buildings, but if you believe that those were impacted or weighed, you can vote for him. But they weren't. He spent 5 seconds on them, never impacted them out, never weighed them. Let's go into why we're winning off of nation building. It's all about economics. So we tell you that economic development happens regardless of intent. That takes on like the link, that takes out the link level analysis he tried to make. Here's the Warren story. This leads to growth because it increases investor confidence. It also leads to growth because governments spend less on militaries and more on better programs, which leads to more stability. He comes back with one term. That's the Ackland term that says that there will be an increased risk of a crash if instability increases, right? Because investors will pull out money. But here's the thing: he never proves that instability increases. Because he never proves that instability increases, he's providing you a link that's not connected to anything. In fact, I proved to you through the evidence about like government spending less on militaries that short-term stability increases. That means that I win the link to Ackland because I'm showing you that the chance that a collapse happens in my world is less because there's less chance of instability increasing because governments are putting more money into social welfare programs. But this is the most important impact in today's round because solving good governance solves back for terrorism, it solves back for oil shots, it even solves back for human rights violations because we make these countries more accountable. And for these reasons, we strongly urge an affirmation. Thank you.